Hey, it's Rachel. I have had a lot of questions lately about designing a garden for saving on groceries. People are very worried about the expense. I totally get it. And because this time of year, there's really not much I can do outside, I figured I might as well dedicate a week to some garden design and focus on what I would do if I was just designing a garden to save on groceries, with kind of an emphasis on beginning gardeners. So somebody that's doing this for the first time, looking to keep it simple and pretty easy. And because it is currently -9 Fahrenheit or -23 Celsius with wind chill, I am going to mostly record this inside at my computer. Quick note as far as crops, if you were trying to save money on groceries, I did look at the things that are the most expensive right now. They clocked in as eggs, berries, nuts, salad greens, peppers, grapes, tomatoes, and green beans, as well as things like summer squash and fresh herbs. My goal was to keep this as simple and compact as possible. I landed ultimately on a design that was 11 feet by 16 feet. I do live in the United States, and the measurements throughout the video will be in imperial. Apologies to those of you in the admittedly more logical metric system. I'm assuming throughout that you would place the garden on the sunny side of the house to avoid casting shade onto the garden. In my case, in the Northern Hemisphere, that would mean the sun coming from the south and then the house being placed to the north of the garden. Let's talk infrastructure. I would begin by placing a chicken coop in the northwest corner of the garden, 3 feet by 4 feet. I know not everybody can have chickens, and I will have an option at the end for those that cannot. But if you can, I highly recommend including them. I would build this coop with the nesting boxes on the north side facing the house for easy daily egg collection. And then I would take a 16-foot cattle panel. This is 16 feet long and 50 inches wide, or in this case tall, because I've put it on its side. And I'm bending it so you have an 8-foot section, 4 foot, and then another 4 foot. I do this so that I can then attach it to the chicken coop. I would overlap it by about a foot, leaving 1 foot here along the southern edge of the garden. This creates a really nice simple compost bin. You can line the inside of it with landscape fabric, so 3 4-foot widths, 12 foot total. And then as this fills with compost over time, you would need to add a door of your choosing. There's a number of videos on how to make a compost bin with a door. I won't belabor it. But the main goal here is to have a compost pile that is directly across from the chicken coop. This allows you to empty out the bedding and put it straight in the compost pile. It also allows you to have, as the chickens are working through material on the ground and creating compost and soil, you can fork that up and add it to the compost bin. Moving on to the rest of the garden, I would have a 4-foot by 8-foot bed along the northern edge and a 4-foot by 12-foot bed along the southern edge. I do recommend concrete blocks for laying out gardens, especially to begin with, because they can be reconfigured if you change your mind. The little holes along the edges are also quite handy. Because they come in 16-inch increments, they add up to 4 feet wide for 3 of them, hence my use of 4-foot modules throughout this garden. I then would add 2 1-foot by 4-foot wooden planters. One of them is along the east side of the chicken coop, and then one along the south side of the compost bin. Now we start adding trellises, so I am trying to get the maximum yield out of a small garden here to save on groceries and minimize cost. That does mean vertical growing. I would take a second 16-foot cattle panel and bend it up into an arch. This end here is secured to the east side of the chicken coop, in between the coop and this planter, and on the east side of the trellis, you would land it 1 foot inside this bed. In order for this to stay put, you would need to add rebar or T-posts into the soil here. Again, there's lots of videos on this. It would have a 5-foot span roughly, and that places it at around 7 feet 2 inches tall for a 16-foot panel. That's plenty of head height for most of us. I would then take a third 16-foot cattle panel and bend it to create another arch. This one starts at the back of the compost bin, arches up and over, and lands on the front of the coop. You could zip tie these together in the back and then physically nail it or screw it onto the top of the coop. Give it some support inside. Ground to ridge is about 10 feet. Plenty of space, even if we grow something on it that hangs down, which we will, and you'll see that in a minute. I would then fill the beds with topsoil and compost mixed, and I would recommend planting them with a Dutch white clover to act as a living perennial mulch. This will outcompete weeds, retain moisture, add nitrogen, and the flowers will attract pollinators. I did not put it here because the plants I'm going to put in here need to be direct seeded. But anywhere where you're going to be transplanting crops, clover is a wonderful choice, and you can transplant directly into it. All right, what to plant? Let's start with this bed in the northeast corner. This is my perennial bed. I would place a trellis down the middle of it, so with wooden pieces at each end connected by wire. This is enough space to put 2 raspberry plants, and as those size up, I would first plant strawberries beneath in the first year, They will take over and act as a ground cover as these raspberry canes start to shoot up from the ground. The nice thing about combining these is bird protection. These will need protection from birds, and specifically your chickens if you have them, as well as overhead birds. Having them all together in one compact area means you can build a framework of wooden supports and drape bird netting over it. Whatever you decide to do to protect from the birds, it's much easier to do it in just one spot. I'll recommend some varieties throughout this video. For raspberries, if I only had two, I would have a Joan thornless primo cane. This means that it sets fruit on canes that are 1 year old, so in their first growing season. They will not set that fruit until the fall. There's another type of raspberry, which is summer bearing, flora canes, and they will set their fruit on 2-year-old canes. You have to prune them a little differently, but the advantage is the fruit comes much earlier in the year. If you plant 2 of these, Joan being a red type and Glencoe purple being a purple, you'll have a variety of color, and you'll have a continuous harvest from June all the way through October. My fall bearers go all the way through November, so you could even get 6 months out of this. Underneath, for the strawberries, Ozark Beauty is a really nice ever-bearing variety. You could add a June-bearing type like Jewel. This sets one large crop all in June and is over and done with. If you wanted to have, in addition to fresh eating, a larger crop that you could immediately put up and preserve as jam or as frozen. Moving on to the trellis here that we're going to walk under as we enter the garden. The space beneath it is a really wonderful microclimate specifically for salad greens. In the spring, when the trellis is empty, they're getting full sun. You could put in things like arugula or lettuce and they will establish and get going. As the summer progresses, this trellis will start to be covered in plants that I'll get into next, and they will provide shade underneath and help to delay the bolting that can otherwise happen in your salad greens. I typically do, as I mentioned, arugula and lettuce in the spring. Once that bolts, I leave it for the pollinators and yank it out, and then in the fall, I put in spinach and lettuce. If you did want some summer greens in here, you could put beet greens and harvest those as well. Let's talk about what goes on the trellises. So beginning with this one at the entry. As mentioned, these cattle panels are roughly 4 feet wide. That is enough space for 2 cherry tomatoes. And I would recommend a Sun Gold and a super sweet cherry tomato. Cherries are a really nice choice for a beginning gardener. They produce over a long period of time. They mature quicker than those big slicer varieties. And they're really, really nice for kids, for snacks, for easy things on salads. In the middle, I would plant 1 bean, a fresh bean vine. 1 is enough for a family. This is a very productive plant and you have to pick them all the time. I personally would recommend the purple potted pole bean there. Over here on the other trellis spanning the coop, I'm recommending tromboncino squash. And again, just so sorry about the clip art that I'm using throughout this video. My SketchUp skills have their limits and here you go. Bear with me, but I would plant the squash here in the 1 foot by 4 foot bed. That's enough space for 2 of them. Let it grow up this trellis and then across this trellis, ultimately landing on top of the coop. This squash I recommend for 2 reasons. 1, very productive. These produce an insane amount of squash. And if you pick them at the green stage when they're only a couple of feet long, it's kind of like getting a zucchini, but with way more productivity for less of a footprint because you can put them up and grow them vertically. The nice thing about growing them vertically is gravity will pull the squash down, and as they hang down, they will grow in a straight shape. When you grow tromboncino on the ground, it coils up kind of like a trombone, hence the name. I personally like them to be straight. It's much easier to harvest and cut and chop and use in the kitchen. The other nice thing about growing them across this trellis is what it does for the chickens. These vines have huge leaves. They're very, very leafy, and they will create a dense canopy overhead. That, as the summer progresses, will give shade to the chickens as well as some overhead protection from predators, which just makes them feel safe and secure when they're outside. My last reason for recommending tromboncino, I have personally found that it has a lot of resistance to squash vine borer damage. I've had years where every other squash plant in the garden succumbed and the tromboncino just kept right on going. So again, for beginning gardeners, I would highly recommend them. Don't forget the outside of the other trellis, so that cattle panel that we bent 3 times, and again, apologies for the clip art, but you could fairly easily establish a grapevine on the outside of this. The nice thing about the cattle panel and the grid shape is it gives you a pretty good framework for creating this espalier, sort of horizontal growing style on the grape, and 1 vine is enough for a family. I would recommend something like Lakemont, Ladyfinger, or Reliance. Those are all seedless and self-pollinating varieties. You just need 1 in order to get a crop. Moving on to this large bed. Last trellis, I promise. This one would be made from some 4x4 posts, 3 vertical and then 2 spanning across the top. and then you would run wires roughly every 2 feet up those 4x4s. This creates a trellis for some hazelnuts. I mentioned that nuts was one of the things I was trying to grow in my perennial list. A lot of nuts take really long to mature. So these are large trees. They can take literally decades to mature. You might not get a crop for 7, 8 years. Hazelnuts are a shrub, so they're much more manageable. They aren't going to take over the whole garden or cast shade on the entire backyard the way that something like a walnut tree or a pecan tree would. So what I'm presuming here is you would plant one on each side and you would do a sort of a fan espalier. So as they're growing up, you'd weave them in and out of these wires and prune them periodically to keep them at a reasonable size. With hazelnut, you do need 2. There's room for 2 in this design. They will not self-pollinate. They have to cross-pollinate. For this, I would recommend 1 Yamhill and 1 Jefferson because they will pollinate each other and they're both fairly productive varieties. The rest of the bed now has a microclimate. Because hazelnuts are deciduous, in the spring, they won't really have started leafing out just yet, and you'll still get good sun on the entirety of the bed. But by the time summer comes around and they're fully leafed out, the north side is getting some shade. So the south side, where it's always sunny, I would place peppers. You've got room for about 12 of them, and they'll get a nice warm sunny microclimate there on the southern edge of the bed. On the north side of the bed, you have room for 8 chard plants. And here, as the shade starts to show up in the summer, completely fine. Chard does not need 8 hours of full sun the way that a pepper does. And I mentioned before that these greens here might start bolting in the summer. That's the point when I would start harvesting the chard. Chard is a biennial. It only flowers and sets seed its second year, meaning your first year you can keep harvesting even through the heat of the summer, and you're not worrying about the bolting. Concrete blocks. I mentioned the holes were helpful, so let's talk about how to use them. Here, under the arch, there's an opportunity to do one more row of these salad greens. They're still getting the nice shade here under the trellis. Here, along the south edge of the perennial bed, it's full sun, and the concrete blocks are going to warm up and get really quite warm. This is a great climate for some Mediterranean-style herbs. This is their happy place. So think basil, rosemary, thyme. You could put things like cilantro and parsley in here. They may bolt on you, and if they do, you can just pull them out and do another round. This is your fresh herbs, easy to access. You're coming in from the house, it's right there. You can pick them on a daily basis. This is a good spot for those. The bottom bed here in the blocks, this is not a place I think you're going to access nearly as often. I would use this for habitat plants. So think borage, aster, bee balm, things like that. This will just help keep beneficial insects, will help kill pests, as well as your pollinators happy, healthy, and thriving throughout the gardening season. Okay, let's talk about what we're planning and what we're getting out of this. If you remember when I was trying to plant, it was a lot. So did we pull it off? So first, let's talk eggs and how many chickens we can get in here. This coop is 12 square feet. That's enough for about 3 to 4 chickens. And then the enclosed space here, I did a red dashed line. You could close this in with low fencing to keep the chickens out of the garden that you could just, move easily when you needed to. That's 36 square feet. Put down some wood chips, some leaves, some carbonaceous material for them to dig around in. 36 square feet is enough outdoor space for 4 chickens. So overall, I'm assuming you've got 4 chickens running through this system. That's enough for 65 to 90 dozen eggs in a year. That's plenty for my family. I suspect it would be plenty for yours as well. This arch is giving you 2 cherry tomatoes and a fresh pole bean. I do not think you will need to buy any cherry tomatoes or any green beans with that many vines for a family. Lots of mixed greens. I eat tons of salads, and even for me, I think this would be enough. You've got that grapevine on the outside of the fence. You've got the tromboncino growing up over this. You're definitely not going to need to buy any squash, I promise. Raspberries, strawberries, you're set. Again, if you can make jams or freeze them, they'll extend throughout the year for you. Herbs, you should not need to buy anything. And then chard, hazelnut, peppers, you are set. You might still choose to buy different kinds of nuts. You might still go to the grocery store, but you're going to have a nice variety here of items that will save you a ton of money. Last, I promised, I know not everybody can have a chicken coop. What I would do if I was not allowed to have chickens here would be to utilize that space instead to put in a 3-foot by 4-foot bed of concrete block and dedicate it to a couple of blueberry plants. You do want 2 different varieties. You'll get a higher yield. 1 is okay. It will self-pollinate. You'll just get more if you have 2. And then the reason and the value of having it in its own bed is that the soil can then be acidified really easily. Blueberries need acidic soil, much more acidic than most plants like. And if you put them in a dedicated bed like this, you can acidify the soil and not bother anything else. That's it. Hope that was helpful. I know this is kind of generic, abstract, just 11 by 16 rectangle. And your particular environment might not work for this specific design, but I hope that the logic and the structure and why I did what I did is useful and can help you in planning your own gardens. Until next time, thanks.